we're talking with an extremely gifted artist. He's also an extremely gifted author. He's written a book called The Transparency of Things. The subtitle is Contemplating the Nature of Experience. And it's, in my opinion, a really remarkable work, Rupert. So maybe we could just sort of go through it and discuss some of the things that I see in here, and maybe you could expand on it, and it would help other people who might be interested in reading this or exploring some of the topics that you have in here. You start out in your foreword by saying that this book is actually a collection of contemplations and conversations regarding the nature of experience. I think it's sort of fundamental to what it is you're trying to do. Maybe you could explain a little bit about this. Why would we want to do this, and what is it that we're trying to accomplish?
Yes, that was something I wanted to make clear right at the very beginning, that there's no attempt being made here to change our experience, to modify it, to make it better, to get rid of suffering, to relieve suffering, to get rid of negative feelings and replace them with positive. There's no attempt at all to change experience in any way. It's simply to take experience and to look clearly at it. And the only experience we have is, by definition, whatever the current experience is. So this means that all we're doing is taking this experience and looking clearly at it.
Right. So why is it that someone would be interested in actually stopping the full force momentum of going on in life with sitting back and actually taking a look at what is the nature of their experience right now? What would motivate someone to want to sort of change gears and sit back and say, well, let me question my assumptions and what's going on here?
The motivation for most of us to replace the current experience with an alternative experience is because we don't like the current experience. And in other words, we feel uncomfortable, we're unhappy, we don't like it. We either don't like this experience or we want another experience. They're two ways of saying exactly the same thing. In other words, there's a feeling of something is missing. I'm not happy. I don't like this current experience and I can't be happy, or I need something else. I need to acquire something else in order to make me happy. So conventional life provides all the means that we know very well to try and make ourselves more comfortable, happy, and most of us have to go through all these to a greater or lesser extent. And then there's the spiritual option or the religious option that's offered: enlightenment, awakening, and that, in some sense, just perpetuates the search. In this case, it's not a search for more money, or it's a search for a particular kind of experience that's going to replace the current experience. And for many of us, we give up the so-called worldly experiences in favor of the spiritual experiences, which are considered to be that much more refined, that much better. And some of us have to do that for a certain amount of time before we realize that it's actually more of the same. It's the same thing in a slightly more subtle packaging, and sooner or later that search fails. We try everything. We meditate for 30 years. We do whatever we do. And in the end, we come back. For most of us, not for everyone, but for most of us, we have to explore to a greater or lesser degree the full range of the possibilities that's on offer in the objective realm, in the realm of the mind, of the body, before we truly feel that it fails and that there's no longer any impulse to go out in search, to replace the current experience. And at that moment, there's a surrender, there's a spontaneous question: well, what is this experience made of? Why do I want to change? And that, in a way, it opens a door to a completely new possibility, which is nothing to do with gaining a new experience. It's to do with going deeply into the current experience. There's no motive in that movement, in that gesture, to change or replace the current experience, but to go very deeply to its core.
So, the phenomena, whether or not it's my attention being focused on acquiring things outside of myself, in the way of cars, women, jobs, all the trappings of the world, or whether or not I'm trying to change by virtue of pointing inwards and trying to find enlightenment, awakening, or to change how I'm feeling or whatever it is, it's all sort of fundamentally based upon an idea that something's missing and that I need to change something. And that somewhere along the way there's a fundamental maybe shift or maybe an opening where we're willing to explore the possibility that maybe that what we're looking for is already here. And that we're starting to turn in and just look at what is as opposed to what could be.
Yes. The hidden implication of this search for happiness, whether or not the search is through conventional worldly means or alternative spiritual means, the hidden and often unnoticed agenda is the presence of an entity that is unhappy and that can be made happy. And sooner or later, the search collapses.
Right.
And the question as to what this voracious entity that's always looking for a new experience in order to become happy, what is this entity? If we spend our whole lives serving this voracious, dissatisfied entity, let's find out a little bit more about it. So the focus is away from acquiring experiences in order to satisfy this entity onto what is this one that wants to be, that is perpetually looking for happiness.
When you talk about the collapse, and that collapse just comes at a certain point where everything that you've done has failed, and your attention now turns into, okay, what do we have here?
What it is that precipitates that collapse varies differently. Some people have to go to the ends of the earth in terms of the ends of explore and experiment with everything. Other people don't seem to need to go so far before
God bless them.
before they begin to doubt that objectivity is going to provide them with what they want.
Some people are brighter than others. The question that you pose and that the book poses and the journey that you and I are going to try to take here as we discuss this is this question: what is the nature of our experience in this moment? What is here now? And that's a brilliant place to start. I guess you use in the context of this book an image that maybe you could sort of use to unfold where it is that we're heading, which is that in the context of the book, that the print of this book is printed on white paper.
Yes.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about.
Yes. If we look at this experience, it consists of thoughts and images. We're both experiencing thoughts and images. We're both experiencing bodily sensations. And we're both experiencing sense perceptions, sights, sounds, textures.
And that's really the sum total of what we're experiencing. We just covered the gamut there.
If we were to ask most people what experience consisted of, that would, at a first casual glance, that's what experience seems to consist of. It's some combination of the mind, the body, and the world. And however, if we look a little bit more closely, there is also something present in our experience which registers this experience, which knows this experience. There is something. We don't even need to give it a name, but there is something that is aware or conscious or knows whatever it is that is being known. And it doesn't really matter what's being known. At the moment, it's sounds and sights, but it could be something completely different.
Right.
There is something that is knowing that or experiencing it, and this is, it's not normally noticed. The apparently objective aspect of experience is so colourful that it takes up the full picture. There are so many thoughts and images and bodily sensations and world perceptions that seems to be what the totality of our experience comprises. But if we look more closely, there is always this something.
Right.
Let's call it something for the moment that is aware, that knows the current situation. Now, what can we say about that? We know, what can we say about it from our own experience? And from our own experience means from this experience, not from any speculation, not from anything we've read. What can we say about it from this moment?
Right.
We know that it is experiencing. It is able to experience. It is because it knows or experiences this experience. And we know also that it is present. Whatever it is present. There's very little else we can say about it because it has no objective qualities. If we try to see it, if we try to find it, if we try to say, okay, yes, there's something which is knowing this experience and and it is present, let's try to find it, let's see what it is. If we turn our attention towards it, we don't find anything objective. Because if it was something objective, it would be something which had the quality either of the mind, the body, or the world. In other words, it would be known by this
Right, and therefore it couldn't be
present.
it.
So it is an undeniable fact of this current experience that this knowing present is our own intimate experience. In fact, it is ourself.
Right.
Because we feel now that I am experiencing.
Right.
So this knowing presence is what we know and what we experience to be our own self. And that is undeniable. But yet, when we look for it, we find nothing objective. So the image that you referred to of the page, the white page, and the print was an attempt to show when we're reading a book. Normally, we're reading a book. We're just aware of the words, and the words are describing whatever it is they're describing. There is no need for us to be aware of the paper. Now, if somebody came to you as you were reading and saying, "Are you aware of the paper?" At that moment, you would say, "Yes, of course," but I wasn't aware that I was aware of the paper. But now that you mention it, it's
of course
it's obvious. So, but by asking the question, "Are you aware of the paper?" it seems to bring something
from the background
new
to the foreground.
Exactly. It's not a new experience when we say yes to the question, "Are you aware of the paper?" At that moment, we're simultaneously aware that in fact we were always aware of the paper. So it's exactly the same thing here. When we ask, first of all, our attention is drawn in the way we've been saying now to the presence of this knowing presence. And then as it becomes obvious to us that this knowing presence is
operational
present,
all the time.
At the same time, it becomes obvious that it's always been present, that it's impossible to have an experience without
it.
That which knows the experience being present, in exactly the same way that it's impossible to have the experience of the words without the paper. It is possible to have the experience of the paper without the words, just as it is possible to have the experience of this knowing presence without the body or the mind or the world. And this is a very familiar experience. It's known as peace or happiness or love. It's something we know very well, but we don't know very often that that's what it is.
So in spite of the fact that we've come to the conclusion through this collapse or whatever it is, that we're going to take a look at what's here, in spite of the fact that the motivation behind trying to complete myself through objects, it's been discovered now that what is this knowing presence is also associated with what I call being happy and being full of peace. So that maybe in actuality, when I was extroverting my senses, extroverting my attention, looking to complete myself and find the peace and happiness that I was looking for, that it was this misplaced attention.
Yes, it's not immediately obvious that this knowing presence that is undeniably present in this current experience, it's not immediately obvious that the experience of that knowing itself is the experience of peace or happiness.
Right.
In most cases, it takes some exploration of the motive of desire and the experience of the fulfillment of that desire before it becomes clear that happiness is a moment, a timeless moment of this knowing presence experiencing itself knowingly.
Right.
This knowing presence is always experiencing itself, but it veils itself. It appears that it's not always experiencing itself.
Right.
And because of this, the search for happiness begins. In other words, a desire is born. When that desire is met by an object, the search collapses. It's not the fulfillment of the desire that causes the collapse. It's the end of the desire.
Right.
And at that moment, this knowing presence ceases to veil itself with its own imagination.
And this perfume comes
and
out.
it tastes itself. It sees the white page, although in this case, in the metaphor, there is something outside the white page which is seeing the white page, which is why it's not a good metaphor, because it is only this knowing presence that experiences. So in this moment of the collapse of the search, this knowing presence tastes itself as it is, not through the mirage of this self-created objectivity. It returns to itself, it remembers itself, it recognizes itself. And that experience is the experience of peace or happiness.
It's very interesting. It's a word that comes up a lot in your book. It comes up consciously, I know it does. And I'm going to call you on it. It's the word knowingly. Consciousness knowing itself knowingly. In other words, as opposed to consciousness, of course, always being aware of all this stuff, in spite of the fact that it's completely caught up in activity, but consciously knowingly knowing itself.
Yes. Whether we know it or not, our experience is always one seamless totality. It is a seamless oneness. There are never two things present in our experience. And at a certain moment, and this moment is always now, it's not something that happened 40 years ago and was cast in stone. It's always in the moment that this happens. At a certain moment, a thought appears in this seamless totality. And the thought goes something like this. It says, I, this seamless totality, am not this seamless totality.
Right.
Instead of being one with the totality of experience, images, thoughts, bodily sensations, sense perceptions, the totality contracts upon itself, upon a small cluster, upon a fragment of the totality. And that fragment is a little cluster of bodily sensations. And instead of giving its identity equally to the totality of experience, the feeling, I am everything, I am one with everything, it says, no, I am something. I am this little cluster of sensation. It contracts upon a fragment. And then at that moment, everything that is not this cluster is projected outside.
Right.
So this knowing presence feels that I, the seamless totality, am not a seamless totality, I am a cluster of sensations. In other words, I am the body. idea is born. And with that idea, and it's the same idea, it's just the other side of the same idea. Yeah. And that is the birth of separate subject and the separate object. With that thought, duality is born. And the subject, the personal subject, and the objective object, the separate object, are two sides of the same idea. They always come together. So this division of the seamless totality into a personal subject and a separate object, it never actually happens.
Right.
It seems to happen. So that's why sometimes I say consciousness pretends or consciousness veils itself. Consciousness always knows itself, even in the apparent knowing of a separate subject and a separate object, where consciousness seems to shrink itself into a subject, and everything that is outside that is not itself. Even in that experience, the experience of the world is still only consciousness experiencing itself. However, it is pretending to itself. It has veiled itself from itself. It is pretending that this is me, but that is not the experience of me. But that never actually happens. That is why sometimes ignorance is called the illusion of ignorance. Because even in this ignorance, even in the ignoring of reality,
what we are,
something is still being known. And the knowing of that apparent ignorance is still the knowing of consciousness knowing itself.
You could never become aware of your own ignorance if you weren't already aware of ignorance.
Yes.
So what's aware of ignorance?
There's another metaphor which is a little, in this respect, a little bit more accurate than the words on the page, which is a very good metaphor and quite a well-known one and often used about the image on the screen, the image on the television screen. When you're looking at an image on the television screen, we think that what we're looking at are cars and people and houses in the foreground and hills and sky in the background. If when we turn the television off, we become aware that we're looking at the screen. And it becomes obvious at that moment, when the television is turned back on again, that we're always only seeing the screen. But once we've turned the television off, and it's become completely clear to us that the screen is present, when we turn the television back on again, we don't lose not only the understanding, but the feeling. We don't lose the feeling understanding that even when we're looking at this multifaceted, apparently multi-dimensional world, that all we're actually looking at is the screen, and that the substance of whatever appears on the screen, however objective and varied it may seem, is in fact only the substance of the screen.
Right. Yeah. So, this process now, exploring the nature of experience, sort of brings us to a point in your book which I think is sort of interesting, in which you start talking about the power of beliefs and what are beliefs and what are facts. Let me read something that you wrote. The mind has built a powerful edifice of concepts about reality that bears little relation to actual experience, and as a result, consciousness has veiled itself from itself. The concepts are built out of mind, and therefore their deconstruction is one of the ways through which consciousness comes to recognize itself again, that is, to know itself again. And then further on you go on, consciousness comes to recognize itself not through the reflected veil of apparent objects, but knowingly and directly. And there we are with that knowingly again. and also the reflected veil of apparent objects, which I think is a very powerful thing that we can get into a little bit later. So you then start with this whole idea about we're going to use the mind to investigate some beliefs. Now, I'm going to go through this. I want to point out some of the beliefs that you think we need to look at, because there's something that's really painfully obvious, is that most people, when we discuss what we're going to discuss, are going to go, these are not beliefs, these are facts.
Yes.
And so your exploration here really has to do with exposing, what you say, the exposure of our false certainties, which I think is brilliant. We're going to take a look at what we've always assumed is for certain and ask ourselves, is this really true? In our experience, is it really true, or is this an inherited belief somehow that we have? So with that in mind, here are a couple of them that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. So let's take a look at a few of the ideas and beliefs that you throw out on the table pretty immediately. Here's one. For instance, we believe that we are a body, that we are a man or a woman, and that we were born and will die. Now, I would say to you that most of the audience watching this film are going to say, what do you mean we believe that we are a body? Of course we're a body. What do you mean I believe I was born and I'm going to die? Those are facts, these are not beliefs. What would you say to that?
Let's take the idea that we're a body. We have to see, first of all, that in order to make a statement about what we are, the only evidence we have is the evidence of our own experience. So, into this exploration, the only evidence we admit is the evidence that we can say, yes, this is my experience. And all experience takes place now. So, the only field of our exploration is this current experience. So let's look. Because anything else is coming from the past. And that's not a valid, that can't be proved now. It can't be validated now by experience. If experience is the criteria of truth. Mm-hmm. So take this experience now, the experience that we are the body. Let's just try for a moment with our eyes shut to make the experiment easier. If our eyes are shut, there is no visual perception of the body. So what is our actual experience of the body in this moment? It's a cluster of sensations. If we look very honestly, very nakedly, as if we had never had this experience before, and in fact we never have had this exact experience before. We look like a child, as if for the first time this unique experience of the so-called body, and we find that it is a cluster of sensations. Now, ask yourself, these sensations, what shape, for instance, do they have? What is our actual experience of their shape?
There is no shape.
There isn't a shape. Does it correspond in any way to the shape, the memory or the image we have? But if our eyes are closed, we have no image of the body.
No, we have no image. We only have our memory, which is incongruent.
So we just stay with the raw sensation itself. Now, where does that sensation appear? What is its relation? We've established that this knowing presence or consciousness is present in this current experience. Whatever it is that is experiencing this cluster of sensations that we're calling the body, it is this knowing presence. Yes? That's a current experience. There is something which is aware of this cluster of sensations. is it our experience that this knowing presence is experienced inside this cluster of sensations?
No.
So right there and then, the fundamental belief that I, this consciousness, this knowing presence, is inside the body, is seen to be a fiction, a belief, imagination. It doesn't correspond directly to the current experience. Now, if we ask ourselves the other way around, does this cluster of sensations appear within this knowing presence?
Well, of course, yeah. Of course. They would be appearances within that which is aware of them.
If that's not immediately obvious, we can go more slowly, we can go step by step. To begin with, it seems obvious that this cluster of sensations appears to this knowing presence, that it seems to be an object of its knowledge. But then we look very closely, again, just in our actual experience, what is the relationship? Where is the interface, the meeting place? Where does this knowing presence end and the sensation begin?
There are no borders or boundaries.
So it's not our experience that the sensation appears to this knowing presence, it appears within it. And we can go more deeply into the experience, that what is the difference? Just try to experience just the substance of these sensations. Is there any part of the sensation that is not absolutely one with this knowing presence? Now, take the experience of the sound of the fan in the background. Is not exactly the same thing true of that sound? Does it not appear in exactly the same place? Is it not made out of the same substance, whatever that substance is, as the substance of the sensation?
Well, it's certainly present in the same place.
If it's present in the same place, what is it that makes us think, I am the bodily sensation, but I am not the sound? Where is the distinction? Is there a distinction? These two experiences, the sound of the fan, which we consider to be not me and outside, and the experience of the sensation, which we consider to be inside and
Brilliant.
me.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely
both,
right. Yeah, they're both occurring in the same place.
They both occur in exactly the same place, and their relation, whatever that relation is, to this knowing presence, is exactly the same. Why do we say, I am the sensation, but I am not the sound? Why do we say the sensation takes place inside me, but the sound takes place outside me? Where is the line in our experience between the me and the sound which is outside? There is no such line. We're not talking about some extraordinary new experience, or something exotic or strange or mystical or spiritual. We're just talking about what is the simple fact of this experience.
Right. So it's somehow sight compounds the confusion.
Yes. When our eyes are closed, quite quickly, if we explore our experience in this way, we come to the feeling understanding, yes, it makes sense. The sound which I conceived to be at a distance is in fact experienced in exactly the same place as the bodily sensation, which I conceived as being closer. We see that they both happen at the same distance from presence, which is no distance at all. Right. Then we open our eyes, and the world seems to jump outside again. So the visual realm is the realm of our experience in which this apparent duality between me and other is most persuasive.
Yeah.
And
we're depending more on that sensory input than we are the others, or we're giving it more weight.
it's more compelling. Duality, the subject-object relationship, the I am here and this is me, and the I am not there and that is not me, split of our experience seems to be at its most obvious, seems to be most obvious in the visual realm. And for that reason, the experiment that we've just done, comparing something which seemed to be outside with something that seemed to be inside, and coming to the conclusion that there's no experiential evidence for that concept. We do the same experience in the visual realm. It doesn't yield quite so easily. Once we've seen, as we did in this exploration of our experience, once we've seen once in our actual experience, not as an idea, we're not buying a new idea, a new belief, but once we've actually felt, yes, it is my actual experience that this sound and this sensation, they take place in the same place, in the hereness and nowness of presence. Once that's obvious about one single experience, we then have a key. For instance, as a way of illustrating that, take the experience of placing your hand on this chair. Now, the hand is considered to be me, and the chair is considered to be not me. So, in this experience of placing the hand on the chair, a new sensation is generated.
Correct.
Yes? It's not there now. Put my hand on the chair. There's a new sensation. And it's one sensation, yes? One new experience. Now, if you were to ask yourself, in this new experience, can I feel my hand? The answer is yes. If we were to ask ourselves, can I feel the chair? The answer is yes. So we admit that it is our current experience, the certainty that yes, we experience our hand, and yes, we experience the chair. However, we've already said that it's only one experience. It's not the experience of a hand and a chair. Well, which is it? As hand, it is me. As chair, it is not me. Now that defies logic. It's either me, or it's... So, then we can take this new sensation that is generated by the hand touching the chair and apply exactly the same experiment. It appears in exactly the same placeless place as the bodily sensation or the sound. It's a similar experiment. It's another version of the same experiment to show us that we think that it's a fact of certainty, beyond all doubt, that we experience a hand and a chair, that we experience a me and a not me. As soon as we do a simple experiment, we see that that is a concept, a belief that has been superimposed by the mind on top of the reality of our experience. But we have become so accustomed to this superimposed belief that we take the belief for reality. And we forget the simplicity and directness and intimacy and immediacy of the real nature of our experience.
So a fact, in essence, what we've called a fact, in essence, is nothing more than a conditioned belief. Exactly. But it's been rehearsed so many times and reinforced so many times that we've forgotten that actually we never experience a separate self. Nobody has ever experienced an outside world. Nobody has ever experienced an object separate, a distinct object. We think that these concepts, they're so part of our mainstream thinking, they're so deeply interwoven into the fabric of the way we think, that we think we actually experience things. But we never experience a separate self. We never experience an outside world. Nobody has ever experienced an object as such. Hopefully I'll be able to dig in a little bit more on this whole idea of what is it that we're experiencing, when we experience the world.
It's going back to the metaphor of the TV screen. There aren't 3 dimensions. The car in the foreground and the hill in the background, it appears to be like that. But we know, and we not only know intellectually, but we experience that they actually all appear on the same plane. Very, very similar here. It is our experience that what seems to be other and outside appears in exactly the same place and is made out of exactly the same stuff as that which seems to be me and on the inside. It doesn't mean that the appearance ceases. Once we know that the apparently three-dimensional image on the TV screen is in fact only two-dimensional screen, the appearance of three dimensions doesn't disappear, but the belief that those three dimensions are real disappears. And we see the two simultaneously.
We're not fooled by the
two-dimensional
experience
screen.
anymore.
We're not fooled by the experience, and that has a profound effect on our experience.
So this is very interesting, and it is very obvious that what we're experiencing is all happening in the same place. So let's now extend it forward into the statement that you're making. We believe that we are a body, that we are a man or a woman, and that we were born, and that we will die. So let's talk about birth and death in relation to this discovery.
Yes. Once this seamless oneness, once this totality has collapsed onto this cluster of sensations called the body, and the I am, the I-ness that is given equally to the totality of experience, has shrunk itself into an I am this body feeling, then the I, this knowing presence, seems to undergo the changes that the body-mind to which it has attached itself undergoes. So because consciousness has collapsed onto the body, it feels that whatever changes the body goes through, it is going through it itself. But as soon as we start to explore the reality of our experience in the way that we've been doing, what we see is that consciousness is not attached exclusively to a cluster of sensations. The cluster of sensations is always flowing, albeit sometimes in big ways, sometimes in minute ways, but it's always moving. This amorphous mass of sensations is constantly flowing inside this changeless presence. Now, try to imagine that the first experience we ever experienced as a newborn child, the physical sensations. Being born, the bright lights. Now, for that to have been an experience, and at the time it was felt, the light was seen, that the bodily sensation, something must have been present to experience that experience. And then 2 minutes later there was another experience, and then another experience. So this flow of sensations and world perceptions was happening in a similar way that it's happening now. But the presence, the knowing presence to which these experiences occurred, was there first, so to speak. The knowing presence wasn't born into the world. The experience of the body-world, in other words, physical sensations and world perceptions, light, sounds, came to
The
this
presence that
knowing.
was already there.
This presence was there, knowing, by definition. Now, if we ask, okay, so we experience the appearance of the body, and it's very similar, for instance, to waking up in the morning. There are no sensations present, the body is not present as an experience, and then, but we as consciousness are present. The bodily sensations appear to or in this knowing presence. The light coming through the curtains, it appears in exactly the same way. We are there already, present. Now, what about this knowing presence? What is our experience of its appearance? Try to imagine, even. It's impossible, because if we say, yes, there was a time when this knowing presence was not present, in the same way that there are times when bodily sensations are not present, and that then there was a moment when we experienced the appearance of this knowing presence, by definition, there would have to have been something present to experience the arising of consciousness. In just the same way that when we wake up in the morning, there is something present to experience the arising of bodily sensations and world. So whatever that something is would be what we are now referring to as knowing presence. It would be present, and it would be knowing the appearance of this so-called... So you're right, not only have we never experienced the appearance of consciousness, it is impossible to experience by definition. And exactly the same is true of the disappearance of consciousness. If we claim that I, this consciousness that is experiencing this current situation, disappears, there would have to be something present to say, yes, it was present, and then it vanished, and I'm still here to witness its absence. That's something which witnesses the disappearance and subsequent absence of consciousness.
Has to be consciousness itself.
So we're not philosophizing here. We're just exploring our experience. We're just talking about what is our experience. Have we ever experienced the appearance and disappearance of consciousness? No. So if that's the case, where does this deep-seated belief come from that I, this knowing presence, was born, that I appeared, and that I'm going to die? Nobody has ever experienced. Yes, we experience the disappearance of the body, but we experience the disappearance of the body not just one big bang after, however, we experience it many, many, many times every night, but even during the day there are many times when the body is not experienced. During the dream, for instance, but also many times during the day when it's just world perceptions or thoughts. There's nothing problematic or painful. There's nothing to be feared about the body not... In fact, we all look forward to sleep at night precisely because the body isn't present. And the mind, it's so peaceful there. It's so... We know that to be the place of rest, the place of happiness. There's nothing problematic about the body disappearing. It's always disappearing. And our actual experience is that I, this knowing presence, never appears and disappears. It never changes. It never moves. It never becomes more or less conscious. It never goes through any grades or levels. It's just always is.
Well, there's this fundamental viewpoint of science in the West, that consciousness arises from the brain and not the other way around. And this is really gnawing at that belief.
Yes. We can do exactly the same experiment that we did trying to see if this knowing presence is located inside a bodily sensation. Take a thought. Just think of anything. It doesn't matter what the... Take any thought and then just simply ask yourself, is it my experience? Is it an actual experience that which knows the thought is experienced inside the thought? I mean, it's absurd.
But I'm going to tell you, that's a dramatic awakening in and of itself. It's the first time you realize that thoughts are appearing.
True. The first time that becomes obvious, it's mind-blowing. Yeah. But when it becomes obvious, what becomes equally obvious at the same time is that this is so simple and so natural, that it's not some fantastic new enlightenment experience, that yes, the thoughts have always occurred inside us. This I, this knowing presence, has never appeared in a thought. So what becomes obvious is its simplicity, its directness, the intimacy of the experience, the intimacy and the directness of the experience with which we know that the body and the mind, and indeed the world, appear inside this knowing presence.
next statement in here, we believe that we are the subject of our experience and that everything and everyone else is the object. Now, we've already sort of tilled the soil. I mean, when you start talking about, is it really our experience that the mountain's out there and that my table's closer in, and what's going on with that whole analysis and that whole belief system. But this whole idea that there is a subject and an object, that somehow that we're separate from what we're experiencing, now comes back into it. And I think when you did the experiment where our eyes are closed and you actually perceive that there's no difference in the place where the sound's appearing and the bodily sensations appearing, that everything's appearing actually in exactly the same place.
Yes.
Okay? That sort of addresses this, but this is a mind-blowing thing. This is something that even when people start the analysis of what they call drik-driksha, which is a Vedanta term, but the whole process of determining who am I, you start with the idea that there's a subject, which is me, I exist, and then there's everything else, which is an object. Okay, so what is it that I'm observing? I observe the world, so I can't be the world. I observe my body, so I can't be my body. I observe my thoughts, so I can't be my thoughts, etc. and so forth. But this thought in here is this awareness that the subject and object actually aren't separate is a fundamental seismic shift in how you do business with life. It starts taking all of the structure and maybe the perception of safety that you have of being separate and start rattling the foundations of the house that it's built on.
There's no safety in the idea of being separate.
Right.
It's not a safe idea. It's a very precarious idea.
In actuality,
it's the opposite.
But what's attractive about it initially is the thought that I can be something, at least I can control myself. And the world out there may be hostile, okay, but there's still something separate over here. And maybe from that evolves this whole belief in separation and all that kind of digression. But that ultimately speaking, it's not giving us the sense of safety that we were looking for initially.
It's not that we feel that the world is hostile, therefore we derive it's precisely because we feel that we manufacture this vulnerable entity which has no reality to it. And because it has no substance of its own, it needs constant maintenance. It needs to be supported by bodily sensations. We need to say, I am this, I am this, I am this, I am not this, I am not this. And because of this feeling, the world, the so-called world, everything that is not me, is perceived to be a continual threat. And it's true, this entity is continually threatened because it's
a fiction to begin with.
Yes, it needs to be supported. Without beliefs, it is nothing. Without the maintenance of belief, the separate entity just collapses. So it needs this either explicit or usually implicit belief, these unrecognized presumptions and assumptions that this entity is real, independent, existent, and that it is separate from the world. Once that belief has taken hold, yes, the world becomes a very hostile place. People become, yes, potentially friends, but therefore by definition potentially
enemies.
So there's this constant fight, struggle with the world until it collapses. And that has a very profound effect on the way the world is experienced. The world is experienced as intimate and friendly instead of potentially threatening and hostile.
I guess if you go through the dissolution of your belief in separation, you end up with the understanding that there's nothing going on that's not you. So how could it be threatening?
Yes.
So, another major idea, we believe that time and space are actually experience, that they existed before we did and will continue to do so after we died. This is blasphemous. You're as blasphemous as Columbus, saying that the world is round, for God's sakes. We all know it's flat. Time and space were here before me, and they're here now, and they'll be here after I'm gone. Why not?
It's actually blasphemous. The other way around is the blasphemy.
Yeah.
To say that I am not this knowing presence, this impersonal, unlimited knowing presence, to say that I am a person is the true blasphemy. Because we have the arrogance, the audacity to shrink this nameless something, whatever this presence is, to shrink it into something that is framed by the mind, into something that the mind can define and limit. That is blasphemous. It's not blasphemous to say, I know myself as this presence that has no limits and that is not personal. There's nothing blasphemous about that. It's precisely the opposite. The real blasphemy is to think that a thought can limit this limitless presence.
So how does that apply to the idea of time and space?
Take time first. It's a little bit easier with time because it doesn't involve the visual
Yeah.
realm. Time is one way we could define time as being the distance between two events. Either, let's say, an event that happened in our childhood and the current event, or the event that happened between something that happened yesterday and something that will happen tomorrow. There are always 2 points, either the present, the apparent present, between the present and the past, or the future, or between the past and the future, or between 2 points in the past, one last week and one last year, one tomorrow and one next year. So there are always these 2 points. Mm-hmm. But now, go to and again, I don't want to go into abstract philosophy. This is just, we're being simple like children. This is childlike simplicity, looking at these 2 points that we say, from which we apparently derive the certainty that time exists. Are they an actual experience? Let's take the experience, the distance between this moment and breakfast this morning. Mm-hmm. We think that there is a period of time that can be measured, let's say 5 hours. Now, where now is the experience, the actual experience of having breakfast this morning?
It doesn't exist except as a memory in the now.
Okay, but the memory of breakfast takes place as a current thought.
As a current thought in the now.
We're talking about the actual experience.
Right.
Because a memory, when we have a memory, it takes place in the present. So we're talking about the actual experience of breakfast this morning, the moment when breakfast took place, compared to this moment.
Right.
As you quite rightly say, the experience of having breakfast is utterly non-existent. So what we're saying is that our certainty of the existence of time depends on one point which is utterly non-existent.
Right.
How can we base our certainty that this time exists when the key definition, the key experience upon which this definition of time depends is in our actual experience seen and felt to be non-existent?
Right.
It's like using the pink elephant that's sitting under your chair as a proof that X, Y, and Z happens. So if we explore, and that's just between the past, but we can do that with
in the future,
in the future, with our childhood. If we do that experiment, and it becomes very obvious that time is an idea, and I'm not suggesting that it's a bad idea, All I'm suggesting is that it's an idea that doesn't bear any direct relation to our experience. It's a very useful idea and a very necessary idea, but it's not a description of our actual experience. If we look at experience, all experience, if we look at any moment when an experience takes place, all we can say is that it takes place now. And this now is not a moment in time. It's not a present moment. There is no such thing as the present moment. There is no such thing as a moment, because a moment is described as something that has a tiny little duration with a vast space of the past behind it and a vast space, no such moment. The now it's a dimensionless. And that is what is meant by eternity. It's ever present. It's not present forever. So in this sense, our experience of, we don't experience time, we experience nowness, presence. And if we look from this understanding, if we now look back at what it is that gives us our sense of continuity in time, what is it that makes us feel that since breakfast this morning, that we have been moving along a line that was continually present? Where does that sense of continuity come from? It comes from the only thing in our experience which is continuous, which is presence. It is presence that lends itself to the appearance, and out of itself creates the appearance of time. But the continuity of time derives its apparent duration from the ever-presentness of consciousness.
Well, you have no reference point other than the ever-presence of consciousness, right?
Exactly.
So, the only thing that seems to put substance to the concept of time is the use of memory, which only occurs in the present.
Yes. So memory is an idea which, as you say, takes place in the present, and it conceives, it paints a picture of something that exists that doesn't exist. That's fine. It's a picture, it's a concept, and it's a very useful concept. But the picture it paints is an idea, it's not an experience.
Right.
And the idea is not problematic. There's nothing wrong or problematic about the idea of time. It's just that it doesn't correspond to our experience. It's a very useful idea. In fact, it's an essential.
I would suggest to you that there are a lot of people who are aging who would say that this idea is very dramatic and controversial, and that the memory that they have of themselves as a much younger, perhaps by their perception, prettier person.
It's the idea that we are
It's an idea,
aging.
it's a concept.
No, but it's the idea that we are aging that is dramatic and controversial. That's truly dramatic, because if we feel that we are aging, that has a very dramatic impact on us. We think we're heading for the precipice.
Right.
So
we're back again to the body.
Yes, but we have no experience of this knowing presence as aging. It is equally present now. It's always been only present. It's just present now and now. It just is, always. But even the idea of always, we're trying to describe something which doesn't fit nicely into the concepts of the mind, because the concepts of the mind are derived from a very dualistic model of experience. So we're trying to use terms, for instance, when we say that consciousness is always present, it's kind of true in relation to the idea that consciousness is sometimes not present. In that sense, it's a valid idea. But the idea that consciousness is always present, it's not accurate. Nothing we say ultimately about consciousness is absolutely accurate, because the idea of always suggests, again, precisely the thing that we're trying to get rid of, which is the sense of continuity in time. So all we can say is, consciousness is. I am.
The concept of always is a time-based concept.
Yes. But then we take away the always and we just... Consciousness is. But that's our experience. And if we think, has that always been our experience, that I, this knowing presence, is present? Yes. It's not so... We may not have noticed it before.
You're demystifying it is what you're doing, which is what makes it powerful.
There's nothing mystical about it. There's nothing... This is not mysterious. I sometimes hear people say, there's something very mysterious about reality. Reality is not mysterious. What is mysterious
is Maya.
object, true, because the implication, when we say that reality is mysterious, the implication is that the world is not mysterious. Objects are not mysterious. These are concrete.
Right.
We know objects. But
Right.
reality, wow, that's really experience. We cannot possibly know that. It's the opposite. Truly, objects are mysterious. Yeah. Objects are so mysterious that we have never seen one.
Right.
As such.
We'll get to that.
And that always ever experienced is consciousness. And that's not mysterious. It's so intimate, so ordinary, so familiar. It's true that we never experience it as an object. And in that sense, it cannot be found in the world of objectivity. But that doesn't mean that it's mysterious. It's so unmysterious, it's so intimately ourselves, it's so utterly and entirely and intimately ourself. It's the least mysterious thing in the universe. What is mysterious are objects which are
It's the appearance of objects.
Objects are so mysterious that they're never even experienced as such. It's the world that is mysterious, not reality, not consciousness.
So, following this line of thought, we're never really experiencing objects. We're experiencing consciousness, and we're experiencing the perception of objects, but not the objects themselves. So all these things are appearing to us and within us.
Yes. Take an object that we see, something that is seen. The tree over there, that we think has an existence, a reality that is independent of that which sees it, whatever it is that is seeing it. The deep conviction that that tree is there when it is not seen. Let's just limit at the moment the conversation to the realm of seeing. So take the experience of the tree, of the seen, the object that is seen. What is our experience of that object if we were to remove seeing from that experience? What would remain of the seen? What remains objectively once we remove seeing? Because what we're trying to find out is, in the experience of the tree, what...
The only thing remaining is consciousness. The only thing is my awareness at that point.
Yes, but what I'm trying to find out, what remains of the apparent object when we remove our seeing or experiencing of that object? Nothing. There's nothing objective that remains. And so, the next question we can ask ourselves is, from where do we derive the certainty that that object exists independently of the seeing of it? If there was something in our experience in the object that was independent of the experiencing, or in this case, the seeing of it, that thing, that part of the experience that was independent of our seeing of it, would remain over after the seeing was withdrawn. Now, what is our experience of that thing that is left over after our experiencing of it is withdrawn?
There is nothing.
Nothing, by definition, nothing. Yeah. So again, we see that our conviction that there is an object independent of our perception is just a belief.
Right.
Again, there's nothing wrong with the idea. It's a useful idea. But once we think that that idea, once it becomes a belief that it is a fact of experience, it becomes problematic.
Because it supports the whole concept of separation.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
So then, in a way, by doing this, we've reduced in our understanding the seen to the seeing of it. What we're saying is that
The process of seeing is the only thing which is unique to what's going on here. It's the only thing that's going on.
yes,
It's not seer and seen, it's just seeing.
that seeing has gone into the make
Right.
of the seen. Now, if we ask ourselves, okay, what about this seeing? What is that made of? And what is our relation to ourself, to consciousness, this knowing presence, to seeing? And we ask ourselves the same question. What if we were to remove consciousness from the experience of seeing? Is there something that would be left over?
No.
No. So we've reduced in our understanding the seen, the apparent object that is seen, to the experiencing or the seeing of
Seeing,
it.
right.
In other words, we've reduced the physical object to a mental perception. And then now we further reduce that in our understanding. We see, okay, what is this perception? Yes, we understand there's no tree, that all there is the image of the tree, the perception of the tree. Oh, okay, that's a halfway house. But then what is this perception? So immediately that there's nothing outside. We're saying really that it's an image in the mind. It's not an object in space.
Right.
It's an image in the mind.
Right.
But now what is the substance of that image in the mind? What is the substance? Yes, it's a perception, it's not an object. But what is the substance of the perception? What is its relation to consciousness? And we find that it's identical. It is not just that the consciousness is aware of the tree outside. If we explore the experience of the seen very, very closely, we see that it is nothing other than the shape that this knowing presence takes. This knowing presence, so to speak, projects itself through the mind to appear as a world. But this projection takes place within consciousness.
Right.
It appears to project an object that is separate from itself, outside of itself, to create a separate world. But actually this projection, like a dream, takes place within consciousness. And if we look to find out what it's made of, and again, this is not philosophy, it's not experience. If we go deeply into the actual felt, lived experience, we see that the substance of every experience is identical with, is made out of the same substance that knows the experience. In other words, the knowing of an object and the existence of an object are one thing. Consciousness and being are the same experience. It's not that there is knowing and there is existence that is known. They are one experience. Consciousness knows a thing by being that thing. That is the way consciousness experiences it. It is everything that it experiences. It witnesses itself and expresses itself simultaneously as the totality of experience. When consciousness experiences something, it is taking the shape of that so-called thing, that consciousness and being are the same thing, that consciousness knows a thing by being that thing, it enjoys. What I'm trying to describe is something that's not at all abstract, it's very familiar. The understanding, the feeling understanding that which knows a thing is the substance of that thing, is an experience that is very, very well known to us. It's called happiness. It's called peace. That's what the experience of happiness is. The realization, and we don't need to formulate it in these terms, that's completely unnecessary. We're formulating it here.
You've just sort of walked through the unfolding of an Indian term of Satchit Ananda.
Yes.
Just sort of walked through the whole movement.
Yes. What happens when consciousness, being, divides, or appear to divide, that when the subject and object appears to be born out of the oneness of consciousness and being, is that happiness is lost, happiness is veiled. And the search begins for happiness, for peace, for love. In fact, for instance, the almost universal desire for intimacy in personal relationships is born, in most cases, of this separation between knowing and being. Consciousness keeps knowing for itself. I am the knower. But it gives being, existence, to the other, to the known. It divides itself, and it doesn't like it. It longs for itself. It longs for the knowingness of its own being. And hence this search, which is the desire for intimacy in relationships, is one aspect of this search, but it's a very powerful and very common, almost universal expression of this search of consciousness for itself, for its home. And because the experience of love, which is the culmination of this experience of intimate relationship, is precisely the knowingness and beingness, consciousness knowing itself as the being, the presence of everything. Love is another name we give. And that's why when we describe, again, this is a very familiar experience, when we describe the experience of love or being in love, we always describe it as a kind of dissolving, a melting, a dropping away of boundaries. And it is precisely this dropping away of the artificial division between the subject, the knower,
and the
object, the known, the me and the you. The I am this, the knower, and you are that. It is the collapse of this that is known as love or friendship. And it's what we long for, because once this separation has taken place, it's very unnatural. It doesn't feel good. And I'm making a caricature in a way of consciousness now when I say that consciousness feels, I'm no longer myself, I feel separated. I'm longing for my home, for myself, to be reunited. In fact, there is no reunification because there's never been any real separation, but it appears to be, and therefore we long for the other. Knowing longs for being, in a sense, is one way we could put it. And their coming together is the experience of love.
So, all objects are apparently objects.
Yes, they're just appearances. And I say just appearances, I don't mean to relegate them, but they are, because they're very useful appearances, but they appear. They have no reality of their own. If we look for their substance, the substance of that object, that substance has no independent reality separate from the substance of that which knows them.
Can't exist without
that which knows an object.
Creates them. Sustains them.
Exactly. Yes.
Brilliant. Coming back to these outrageous statements of beliefs that were parading around as facts before, and I'm trying to come back to what you were saying, because these conclusions are really massively destabilizing how we interact with life and with each other. But we've talked a little bit about the illusion of time. It's a whole nother matter for most people to get an understanding of the illusion of space. Okay? And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that element as well.
In some ways, it's easier to explore the illusion of time because time is created just with the mind, just with an idea, as we explored. But space has a sensory element. Not only do we believe the concept of space, but we feel that it exists. For instance, we feel that it is an absolute fact of our experience that I am here and that house on the hill is at a distance, and it's not quite as far away from me as this table, which in turn is not quite as far away from me as that chair.
Right.
And it's not just an idea that we have. We feel. The conviction is at a more bodily level. In some ways, it's a deeper conviction. It's not so difficult to explore the idea of time in the way we explored it and come to the true understanding that time is not experienced. It requires a much deeper exploration of our experience to come to the same conviction with the same clarity that space is also equally an illusion.
Yeah.
Because it includes that part of ignorance that is lodged in the body. It's not just that I believe that I am a separate entity, I feel. The vast majority of it is felt, not just believed. It's relatively easy, I say relatively, if we explore the nature of our beliefs very thoroughly, we come to an understanding, yes, there is no evidence in my experience to substantiate the idea that I, this knowing presence, is limited. However, we still feel, yes, I am here, or I am inside here, looking out through the mind at something that is not me, at a distance from me. And in order to come to a really stable feeling, understanding that what we are is not limited or personal, and therefore that the world is not distant or other, we need to explore this feeling of being located in the same way that we investigated the belief in being. So we're going to do it in our imagination. Imagine the sound of a dog barking in the distance that we see instead of seeing the house on that hill over there. There is a dog barking. And we both see it and hear it. And we think that both the sound of the dog and the sight of the dog confirm our conviction that the dog is at a distance from ourselves. Let's deal with these two experiences one by one. Let's separate them slightly artificially. The sound from the sight. Leave the sight on one side. We just explore the direct experience of the sound and ask ourselves where that sound is taking place. And let's compare it, for instance, to something that we feel is much closer to us than the sound. We think that inherent in the sound is the fact that the sound is taking place at a distance. What we fail to notice is that the interpretation, the sound is taking place at a distance, is an interpretation of the experience. So we take away the interpretation. Let's not even reinterpret it at the moment. Let's just take away, put the interpretation, the conventional interpretation on one side, and just go to the raw experience and compare it with an experience that we consider to be much closer, much more me. So we take, for instance, let's take an experience of, say, the tingling in our face, the tingling that we interpret as being my face. You have this cluster of sensations and the sound. Abstract those two experiences. Put everything else in brackets, so to speak, and just hold these two experiences, the sound of the dog and the tingling in the face. Put them, so to speak, in front of you. Just hold them up in front of you for observation, for contemplation. And be very careful not to bring in the interpretation in either case. Leave the fact that we call it a dog, we think it's at a distance, or that this is called the face, the body, that we think it's close. All that, put it in brackets on one side. Just raw sensing in the case of the sound, and raw perceiving in the sense of the sound, and raw sensing in the case of the body. And just sit with these two experiences. Don't try and manipulate them. This is nothing to do with manipulating experience or changing experience. It's only to do with experiencing experience as it is, or rather, allowing experience itself to reveal itself as it truly is. Not filtered through the superimposed concepts that the mind imposes on experience itself. So just sit with these two raw, the perception, the sound, and the tingling, the sensation. And take time. Put them both in front of you until it becomes absolutely clear that they both happen in the same place. Whatever that place is, we don't need to label it. We don't need to give it a name. All that's important is to come to the actual experience, which is not a new experience. In fact, it was always thus. It was always the case that these two so-called two experiences take place in the same place.
Absolutely.
The apparent sound in the distance, the apparent sensation in the foreground.
All occurring in the same.
They both take place in the same place, and that place is one with whatever it is that is experiencing them. We don't even need to give it a name. There is something that is experiencing the sound and the sensation, and that something is one with. Both experiences
are coming from it, are arising within
are
it.
the same distance away,
Yeah.
which is no distance at all.
Right.
So, then we open our eyes. And that understanding that the sound of the dog and the sensation of the face are equidistant from ourselves, one is not closer to ourselves than another, came from the most simple, childlike experience. So then we open our eyes and we look at, and again, the illusion of distance, of space, seems to be confirmed, no longer now by the sound, but by the sight of the dog. First of all, we reason with ourselves, the dog is only one thing. As a sound, it seems to be close, intimate. As a sight, it seems to be at a distance. Because that's what we're saying, yes? As a sound, it seems to make sense that everything takes place here, now, inside. But that as soon as we open our eyes, the world jumps outside. But the dog cannot be both. It cannot be inside as a sound and outside as a visual perception. So that defies logic. And we know that it's our experience. We don't experience the dog in two places at the same time. One close on the inside, two at a distance on the outside. We experience it in the same place, whatever that place is. So having established from our direct experience that as a sound, the barking is intimate, close, at one with ourself. And that's a fact of experience. It must be the case that either that experience is false, and that the dog is truly outside at a distance, or if that experience is true, and we've already established that it's true, the sight of the dog must happen in the same place as the sound of the dog. So sit with your experience of the sight of an object in exactly the same way that we sat with our experience of the sound of the object, and allow it to reveal itself in the same way. We don't go and try and grab this experience. We allow the obviousness of it to come to the foreground in just the same way that if, as we sat with the sound and compared it, so to speak, with the sensation in our face, it became more and more obvious. They happen in the same place. We do the same thing, but it takes, in most cases, longer for the visual realm to yield its sense of otherness. the sound happens quite quickly.
Quite quickly.
And what we can do, if the conviction that the scene is taking place at a distance, we can go back, we close our eyes again, and we can go back to the experience where we know that everything is inside. Not inside this body, but inside
that which is experiencing it.
And then establish ourselves in that feeling understanding, in that knowingness again. And then from that place, being careful to stay as present, we then open our eyes and let the experience come into that space. We don't go out to the object on the end of the hill. We stay where we are, not where we are in this chair, where we are as presence, as this knowing presence. We feel, as we open our eyes, that which appears in this knowing presence, in exactly the same way that we came to understand and feel the sound. And we can go back and forth, closing our eyes and opening our eyes. And if we do this, and in most cases it takes some time, the conviction, not just the mental conviction, but the feeling conviction that the object on the other side of the hill is at the same distance from this knowing presence as our most intimate bodily sensation. It becomes more and more obvious. And with that obviousness, that self-evident experience, space collapses. Because that which is seen at the farthest most, the moon, the perception of the moon, takes place. And that space, the idea of space, and the apparent physical experience of space is superimposed onto the actual experience. There is no actual experience of space. Every visual perception takes place in exactly the same placeless place as the most intimate bodily sensation or thought. And as we experiment and explore our experience in this way, it becomes more and more obvious. We can't grab that. We can't make that experience happen. It comes to us. It becomes more obvious.
The more you allow yourself to experience it, I guess it would.
Yes. It's not that a new experience is taking place. What's happening is that the true nature of experience is revealing itself, not to us, but to itself.
Well, there's also sort of an awakening or a realization that our sense of sight and vision is dramatically covered by our beliefs. And that when the beliefs are removed, you begin to realize that everything that you're seeing in any given moment is all occurring within that same space.
Yes.
That everything, absolutely everything is occurring within that same space.
Yes. That doesn't mean that the appearance of space disappears.
No.
The appearance of space stays exactly as it was.
Yeah, but your belief in the appearance is different. And how you interact with it, I guess, becomes some different.
There's just something I'd like to add to that the space conviction that it is our experience, that we experience an object at a distance in space, is dependent upon the conviction that we are this body, because everything is measured in relation to a location called this body. So the idea that this chair is at a certain distance and that the house on the hill is further away is dependent on the idea that I am this cluster of sensations. So the exploration, we can explore both simultaneously. What is it that makes me feel that this sensation is closer than that perception? They both collapse together. The idea, so every experience takes place here, but the here is not a physical location, and we can't understand that the perception of the house on the hill doesn't take place at a distance and yet maintain the feeling that I am located here.
Right.
They collapse together.
Right.
The idea that this is closer.
They're connected.
And that they're actually the same belief, the same experience. And if we put the experience that we think is close, like the tingling of the face or the tingling behind the eyes. We put it in front of us. We contemplate it at the same time
as we contemplate
as something that we think is at a distance. We see that neither one or the other is any closer, in our actual experience, is any closer or further away than the other. So it's not that everything happens inside, because when we see that nothing happens outside, the outside collapses. You can't have an inside with an outside. We can't say, yes, I know that no longer, there's nothing outside anymore. And yet I know that everything's inside, because inside doesn't mean anything. It's defined by that which is outside. Yeah. So as the sense of outside collapses, the sense of being inside collapses. And really, you can start with either. Yeah. You either start with the sense of I am inside the body, or with the sense that the world is outside the body. They both lead to the same collapse of space and time, and leave just simply presence, that which is.
You can't have an inside without an outside. Just in the same way you can't have time without 2 points.
Yes. Yes.
So this then takes us to the last frontier. Because if you've gotten this far along the train, you have established for yourself that you are something other than maybe you thought you were when you started this exploration. And that's that what you may be, the thing that appears not to be changing, the thing that is always consistent, is the presence, the awareness, the consciousness that I am. And as we go through these exercises, we start deconstructing the framework of the house, pulling it out nail by nail, and who knows at which point you're going to pull out a nail and the rest of the house is just going to collapse. What happens somewhere along this point is another belief, and you stated here, we believe that objects exist independent of their being perceived, that consciousness is personal and limited, that it is a byproduct of the mind, and the mind is a byproduct of the body. We're going to get more into that, and you further go on to call this the religion of materialism, which is a great way of putting it. But even as one begins to identify with consciousness as opposed to the belief that I am a body, there is another step. And that step is the belief that this consciousness is personal to me. So I guess the next part of this belief structure then that we're talking about is who owns consciousness? Where do I get this sense that I exist independently from you? And where does this personal sense of consciousness go to? And does it really stand up to my direct experience? That exercise is supported, a lot of this stuff is really supported through an inquiry conducted within the mind. One of the things that I find interesting is that there are a lot of people who are looking at the nature of reality and trying to figure out who they are, who have a sort of knee-jerk reaction about utilizing the mind as a tool to determine what the nature of reality is. And in fact, you say in your book here of those who have an aversion to using the mind at all, that all spiritual traditions acknowledge that reality cannot be apprehended by the mind. And as a result of this understanding, some teachings have denied the use of the mind as a valid tool of inquiry for exploration. So in any case, we've come to this last belief that even if we've come to the conclusion that what we are in reality is the awareness or the consciousness, there's still this residual belief that consciousness is personal. And there, furthermore, is this aversion that many people have who are following this path of using the mind as a tool of inquiry to determine what the nature of reality is. And you say it really beautifully here. You say, ignorance is composed of beliefs. And I'm going to define ignorance as being ignoring who we truly are, ignoring the true self. Ignorance is composed of beliefs, and belief is already an activity of the mind. Now, we've just gone through this whole exercise where we looked at things that we thought were facts that are in fact beliefs, and we've seen how illusory those beliefs are upon direct examination. If we deny the validity of the mind, why use it in the first place to harbor beliefs? So I guess your point here would be, since our entire operation and how we interact with each other and how we interact with the world, how we interact with our body, how we perceive everything that's going on, is all operating on things that we've called facts, that are actually beliefs, and furthermore, are beliefs that don't stand up even to the most childlike, simple observation of what's going on. Okay? How is it that we would then say that there's no value using the mind to investigate the nature of ignorance?
The mind is only required to investigate ignorance if there is ignorance. If we believe that we are a separate entity, then that belief is already made out of mind. If that belief is not there, then this investigation is not necessary, because it's known and felt that what we are is this knowing presence, and more than that, that it is this knowing presence which is expressing itself as the totality of our experience. However, if that feeling understanding is not present, then consciousness, this seamless totality, has already veiled itself from itself through thinking. The screen of consciousness, the screen of presence, has projected an image in the form of a thought. And this thought says, I am not the totality. I am a separate entity. So it has already appeared to limit itself by this thought. Now this thought, it's true that this thought itself is an expression of the totality. In that sense, it is not ignorant. It is the shape that this totality is taking at that moment. Hence, ignorance is truly only an illusion. However, it's a very persuasive illusion, and it seems that in projecting this smokescreen, so to speak, composed of thoughts, that consciousness divides itself from itself. It divides itself into a personal entity. This thought, like any other thought, irrespective of its content, is an expression of consciousness, is made out of consciousness. In that sense, nothing needs to be done to it. That's true in theory, except that with this thought, inherent in this thought is, I, this totality, am not this totality. I have limited myself. So we can't make the claim legitimately at the same time that we harbour the belief in being a separate entity, and at the same time we know that everything is an expression of the totality, because the two positions are mutually exclusive. By saying I am a separate entity, we are saying I, this knowing present, am not the totality. We cannot harbour these two beliefs at the same time. So once that belief has taken place, the investigation is necessary to explore whether the belief, whether the thought of being a separate entity is a valid, true representation of our experience. And the reason it's effective, the reason it's, we could say, legitimate, is that the thought itself is an expression of consciousness. So it's true that it seems to veil consciousness from itself, seems to veil the totality of consciousness from itself. This thought that the totality is not the totality is what creates this sense of being a separate person. But this thought is ultimately an expression of consciousness. It's not independent or separate. Therefore, this thought, which acts like a sort of smokescreen that makes consciousness feel that it's not experiencing itself, as this thought is investigated, it's like the image on a screen that slowly fades. As we explore this feeling of being separate, we go more and more deeply into the thought, we explore our experience, and in doing so, the thought, the conviction, it's like the image on the screen that fades. And as it fades, it goes on and it gets thinner, it gets less substantial. Our conviction wanes. And as the image fades, in this case, as the belief is eroded through the investigation, the substance of the thought begins to shine through. It's not that thinking apprehends reality. No. It doesn't. Nobody ever said that by using the mind, by using thought, we are somehow going to frame reality. Not at all. Not at all. Reality is outside the grasp of the mind. However, the mind, even in ignorance, is an expression of this reality. And because it is an expression of it, because it is touching reality, because it is actually one with reality, when we undress the mind, so to speak, when the belief in ignorance fades, it leaves us in the true substance of the mind, which is called understanding. The understanding doesn't take place in the mind. The understanding is what is revealed when the belief collapses, and it either collapses like that, or in most cases it fades slowly. And what it reveals is that which is its substance, that which was behind it. So the idea that the mind is useless is actually a fundamentally dualistic perspective, because what it is saying, the presumption, the implication of that statement is that the mind is completely separate from consciousness. If that was true, this investigation would be absolutely useless. But the mind is, even in the utmost ignorance, is completely one. So that the deconstruction of the mind, the unveiling of the mind, is the revelation of that which is its substance. It's precisely because the substance of the mind, even the most ignorant mind, is itself presence, that the exploration of this ignorance is the revelation. The mind collapses, and it's the collapse of the mind that is the experience of understanding. Understanding, it can be then formulated by the mind, but the understanding doesn't take place in the mind, and that's often misunderstood, and people who are skeptical about the use of the mind are right to be skeptical about the mind's capacity to
understand.
But the mind understands nothing. It doesn't even understand what 2 plus 2... The mind is always understood. It doesn't know anything. Right. It is known.
So, this experience of understanding goes on every moment of the day. We have conversations, we're thinking about things and all this stuff, and then the moment in between two thoughts, the understanding occurs. The mind can come back in then and take that understanding and try to put words to it or try to claim it as its own. But the fact of the matter is, the understanding has occurred.
Yes, the presence, knowing presence, is present all the time. This is just an image, so it's limited, but we could say that knowing presence is always present. It then creates within itself a thought which appears to obscure itself from itself. It then explores this veil, and as the veil of thinking collapses, it again experiences itself. When presence experiences itself at the end of a process of thought, it calls itself understanding. Presence was there all along. It took the shape of this ignorant thought and became thinking. Ignorant thought collapsed, and then this presence knows itself as understanding. The experience of understanding is simply the experience of it knowing itself. In fact, even during the ignorant thought itself, this presence is still only knowing itself, but it doesn't know that it knows itself. It thinks that it has forgotten itself. And hence the suffering, hence the search begins. But even then, even in ignorance, and in that sense, it is true that everything, truly everything, even the most profound ignorance, is an expression of reality. If we know that, it is true. There is nothing to be done to ignorance because it is already known to be an expression. However, if that was known, why would it express itself as ignorance? So at the level of the mind there is some contradiction there. Of course, if it is known that everything, including ignorance, is an expression, then there's nothing to do.
Yeah.
It is already the way that this totality is expressing itself. But if that's the case, there would be no ignorance.
You're speaking to a very hot topic in today's Advaita community, which is the whole advent of Neo-Advaita and the belief that there is nothing to do and nothing that needs to be done, that whatever is going to happen will happen spontaneously and in the moment when grace allows it to happen. And the controversy of some of the Neo-Advaita teachers in that camp as opposed to what I consider to be an approach much more congruent with what you're saying, which is that as long as there is the belief in separation, then using the mind to investigate the nature of that belief and the reality of that belief is helpful. That at the moment that there is no longer a belief in separation at all, then it is true that there's nothing to be done. Until a moment that awareness is evident.
Once consciousness has pretended to veil itself from itself and assumed the form of a separate identity, suffering is inherent in that position, and seeking is inherent in suffering. They go together. So we cannot at the same time take the position that I am a separate entity, and then at the same time say that it's not necessary to do anything.
Right.
Because we are already doing something. And seeking is inherent in that position. So if we think that we are a separate entity, at best all we're going to do is take the belief that there is nothing to do and superimpose it on top of the belief in being a separate entity. We're then, in some ways, in a worse position than we were before. Not only are we stuck with the suffering that is inherent in the separate entity, but on top of that, we have denied ourselves the possibility of exploring this sense of separation by superimposing another belief on top of the belief in separation. And that belief is, there is nothing to do. If we know that we are this knowing presence, if that's truly known, if we haven't just heard it 100 times, however that experience comes to us, there are many ways but however that experience has come to us, if it's true of us, then it is absolutely true. But then the question doesn't arise as to whether there is something to do or not.
Right.
It's a redundant question. So there is no contradiction between these two statements. There is something to do and there is nothing to do. Both of them are equally true from the perspective from which they are spoken. This understanding, it's not a point of view. Everything that is said here is provisionally true, but nothing is absolutely true. So if we find ourselves fixed in any position, then that's a warning sign that any position must by definition be an entrenchment of the mind. Even if we're saying, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to do. If that's a belief, it's a position in the mind. It's not the true understanding, which is very free. to take any position in response to the given situation. It might say, 1 minute, there is absolutely nothing to do in response to a given situation, a question. And that would be absolutely true and correct. 2 minutes later, somebody else might say something. An experiment or an investigation might be suggested. Now, there's no contradiction between these two, although one may appear to contradict the other. The understanding is very free, totally without prescribed direction, and it can take whatever shape is necessary in the moment to reveal the true nature of experience. And I think that's something that is one of the hallmarks of a true teaching, one that has this freedom from a point of view, this freedom from a perspective, this freedom from a position, from a stance.
So, assuming then that this exercise of exploring our beliefs is a valid approach, and we've certainly, I think, have substantiated through experimentation during this talk that, in fact, it's productive to do so. Eventually, you come to the question, well, okay, if I'm not my body, if I'm not thy mind, if I'm not the world, what am I? What is left? So what we are is consciousness. And then we move on to maybe the next question, which is, what is the nature of consciousness? And my belief now, my core belief, still deep down inside of me, that somehow my consciousness is now separate. And to that end, you say, consciousness veils itself from itself by pretending to limit itself to a separate entity, and then forgets that it is pretending. As a corollary to this self-limitation, consciousness projects all that is not the separate self outside of itself. This projection is what we call the world. And thus, the separation between I and the world is born. Okay? You've spoken quite a bit about this whole idea. You can't have a separate me without a separate world, that it's all one movement.
Yes.
So there is this myth of separation, and then that brings us to this whole idea or concept or belief, again, that consciousness is of the mind, that the mind is of the body is of the world. And the way you put it here, everything falls into place is the name of the chapter. I, this consciousness that is seeing these words and experiencing whatever it is that is being experienced in this moment, is not located inside a mind. The mind is not located inside a body. The body is not located inside the world. The body is simply the sensation of the body, and the world is simply the perception of the world. And if we look clearly at the substance of the mind, I'm jumping down, the substance of perceiving and sensing, we find that it is none other than the consciousness in which it appears. So we're back now to the idea of consciousness, and yet during this experience that you and I have been exploring, we find nothing in the experience that suggests that consciousness is limited.
Yeah.
And yet there is persistent belief, maybe this last remnant of holding or grasping, that wants to say that consciousness is personal.
But Chris, you've just contradicted yourself. You said we've explored experience and we've seen clearly from experience itself that there is nothing limited about consciousness.
Right, there's no boundaries, there's no borders.
But if that's the case, and I know that you're speaking from experience, when you say that you've explored it and you've seen that there's nothing in your experience which validates this belief, when you say that after having come clearly in your experience to the fact of your experience that consciousness is is not limited. And then you say there is a residual belief that it is personal. If it is personal, that is another way of saying it's limited. You're saying it belongs here, but not there. So it suggests two things. One, that the investigation into the limited nature of consciousness is not complete. Or that there's just a kind of habit of the mind.
Let me share something with you quickly. There is a difference, I'm sure you will agree, between the intellectual understanding of something as basic as I am not separate and the feeling or the emotional resonance
Yes.
of being separate. In my experience, that beyond the experience of thinking, there comes down to a point of not fear, of abject terror around the issue of this down below. And that the most that I can do with that is to be aware of it and to watch it and witness it come and
Yes,
go.
exactly. When you say, I've explored my experience, and there's nothing in my experience to suggest that consciousness is limited, and yet I still have the belief that it's personal. I think, exactly as you've just said, what you're really saying is not that I still have the belief that consciousness is personal, but I have the deep feeling, in spite of my conviction and true understanding at a rational level, I still have the feeling. And that involves a much deeper level of investigation that's not so often engaged upon. It involves sitting with the feeling that I am this body. And if we take an intimate bodily experience, any sensation in the body which we deeply feel to be me, intimately, privately, only me, and try to do this as we're speaking it, take a sensation that we consider to be me. Sensations around our face are very intimate. Take the sensation behind the eyes and just experience it as raw sensation and ask yourself, does the sensation itself come with a label attached to it? Is there an inherent label that says, this is me? In the raw sensation itself, there are no thoughts present. Take the thought, this is me, and put it on one side. We don't even need to get rid of it. Just take the commentary, the interpretation of the sensation away. Put it in brackets, leave it on the side. Just go to the experience, this tingling sensation behind the eyes. Go back like a child. Give it no name, no shape, or rather see that it has no name, no shape. Experience it just as it is. Ask yourself, what is it about that sensation that is me? Why is it more me than the sound of the fan? Go back to your raw experience. For instance, try to take 2 points in the body. Take the tingling behind your eyes and the sensation on the sole of your foot that is touching the floor. Compare those two sensations. One of them feels closer to you than the other. I mean, how absurd is that? We think that I am the totality of this body, and at the same time we think that the tingling behind my eyes is a little bit closer to me
than the one in my feet.
Okay, so then we're getting more precise now. We not only think that I am located
in the body,
all over the body, but actually we're more located here. And if we explore, there are two regions for most of us. Mm-hmm. The center of feelings, I am in here, we often, or I am in here. But then, if we close our eyes, do we even have a sensation, this tingling that we say behind the eyes? Why do we say it's behind the eyes? Why do we even say that it is in the head? What is our experience of the head in which we think this sensation is taking place? Do you actually experience this containing cavity called the skull in which this sensation is taking place? No.
No.
This sensation is taking place inside consciousness.
Right.
But we think it's so obvious to us that this tingling sensation is behind the eyes. There's no experience of that. But it takes time.
There's a belief in a blueprint called a head.
Yes, yes. It could be that we have the odd sensation of tingling, but one sensation doesn't take place inside another sensation. Have you ever felt sensation, when we say inside the body, it's an absurdity. What is this body inside? If we have a sensation called the body, which we don't, but if we did, and a sensation called this tingling, two sensations, they don't appear. Do we ever have a sensation of an experience, or indeed of a thought inside a head? Have you ever seen a thought inside a sensation? That none of these, they're all concepts. We've never experienced the body in the way we conceive of it. We've never experienced one part of our body being closer to us than another part. We've never experienced a thought inside a brain or a thought inside We've never experienced consciousness inside the body. We've never experienced consciousness inside the mind. They're all superimpositions, uninvestigated superimpositions that we have become so accustomed to as to take them for reality itself. But they're simply not our experience. Our experience is that there is presence and that the mind, the body and the world appear equidistant, at the same, not one within the other. They all appear in the same plane, so to speak. And that plane is the plane of consciousness. Of course, consciousness is dimensionless, so they are essentially dimensionless, that they appear inside